Hello. You're listening to Late Edition Crime Beat Chronicles, a product of Lee Enterprises. My name is Chris Lay, and I'm the podcast operations manager for Lee. With Late Edition Crime Beat Chronicles, we're going to be presenting notable true crime stories as reported by journalists working for the regional newspapers that covered them from the dozens of various Lee Enterprises-owned publications around America. For this first series, we're taking a short drive east of Tulsa, Oklahoma, to learn more about the state's most notorious cold case, the 1977 slaying of 3 Girl Scouts. What you're about to hear is the second episode in a 6-part series, so head back to episode 1 to start from the beginning if this is the first episode that you're hearing. Given the subject matter for this and presumably just about every story that we're going to document going forward, there are some obvious content warnings to impart, so while everything here would be fit to print in a newspaper, parents are cautioned to give the episode a listen before sharing this with any youngsters. What you're going to hear first is audio from a series of articles written by Tulsa World journalist Tim Stanley and published in 2017 to mark the 40th anniversary of the tragedy. And then, you're going to hear a conversation between myself and Tim about his experiences reporting the series so many decades after the initial crime. For now, here's Tim reading Chapter 2, which is titled, I Wanted Her Home.
The waking, Betty Milner said, was the hardest part. For many years, even after she could sleep through the night again in peace, there was no defense, no way to steel herself against what the morning brought. Every day it was a struggle, she said. Every day when I opened my eyes, my first thought was that my child was gone. You look outside and the world goes on, the sun shines, the birds sing, and you ask, why? After her daughter Denise's murder, there would be a lot of whys for Milner. Each of them, just like that one, unanswerable. But there were also a lot of reasons not to give in to them. And so Milner dug in. She raised her remaining daughter, Kathy, and eventually welcomed another, Crystal. She also bettered her prospects, going from a teacher's aide to a new career as a hospital lab tech. 40 years since her daughter's murder, though, finds one constant for Milner. She still lives in the same house. Leaving just wouldn't seem right, she said. Too many memories. Denise was in a hurry to do everything, said Milner, who when she talks about her daughter can't help laughing. She walked early, she talked early, she wanted to be involved in everything. Gymnastics, tap dancing, singing in the church choir. Between all of it, there were not enough hours in the day for that child. In 1977, Denise, a 5th grader at Burroughs Elementary, added another activity to her growing list. It was her first year in Girl Scouts. It never occurred to me that she would want to go to camp, Milner said, adding that her daughter had never stayed overnight anywhere. But Denise worked hard selling cookies, which earned credits to pay her way. For Milner, this is a point in the story that brings another one of those maddening whys. At the last minute, the day before leaving for camp, Denise had had a sudden change of heart after learning that some friends had decided not to go. She didn't want to go either, she told her mom tearfully. Milner encouraged her to go ahead and try it. 40 years later, she still asks herself why. Which is pointless, she knows, and just leads to other whys. Like, why had she let Denise go to camp to begin with? If I hadn't let her go, this wouldn't have happened, Milner said. I still deal with the guilt. It's still in the back of my mind. We never let her go anywhere overnight. Why this time? On Monday, June 13, 1977, and the days immediately following it, the why wasn't important. The question on everyone's minds was who. 3 young girls murdered and sexually assaulted on their first night at summer camp. Who could have committed such a horrifying crime? The bodies of Denise Milner, 10, Lori Farmer, 8, and Michelle Gousset, 9, had first been discovered shortly after 6 a.m. Monday by Counselor Carla Wilhite. She was on her way to take a shower when she saw them. about 150 feet from their tent near the base of a tree. Because Lori and Michelle were zipped inside their sleeping bags, she did not see their bodies at first, but Denise was lying on top of hers in plain view. It was obvious she was dead, Wilhite said, though she did not initially recognize her as Denise, the girl who the previous day had made such an impression on her. Unable to make sense of what she was looking at, Wilhite assumed there had been a terrible accident and ran for help. She would return with the camp director and nurse. Only then, she said, did she realize the full truth, that not only was this no accident, there were 2 other children. Wilhite recalls the moment when it all sank in as one of terrible fear, and she couldn't believe what she found herself saying. Someone came in and killed 3 of our kids. Lori and Michelle, it would be determined in the official autopsy, died from blows to the head. Denise was also beaten, but died from strangulation by ligature. All 3 had been sexually assaulted, at least 2 of them raped. All of which brought up the other big question. How could something like this have happened and nobody heard it? The girls had been attacked during the night while they were sleeping. Much of the attack had taken place inside their tent, mere yards from 7 other tents, including the counselors' tents. Surely, in the course of such a violent encounter, there had been noise. For these and other questions, investigators immediately began trying to find answers. And they needed to move fast, they knew. Not only to solve the crime, a vicious sex murderer, as newspapers then termed it, was at large. Until that person or persons was caught, was anyone safe? By the time he started writing about the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders as they came to be known, Tulsa World State reporter Doug Hicks had covered well over 100 murder cases, which meant he'd long since mastered a necessary skill: emotional detachment. Basically, when I cover a story, I don't have any emotions. I'm on the story, Hicks said recently. The details of the Girl Scouts case never affected me in what I did. Now, did I think about it later? Yeah, sure I did. When you finally stopped, it was a sad, sad story. As sad as any he'd covered before, or would after. I just go back to the families every time, said Hicks, now retired and living in Jinx. That's where my heart is, for those families, the parents. I just felt like they were the real victims. Sherry and Charles Beau Farmer, George Ann and Richard Gousset, Betty and Walter Milner. Hicks came to know most of them well. The children were gone, he said, but the parents were all just engulfed in this. But Hicks, the world's lead reporter on the case, still felt a responsibility to the girls. If you look back at the stories, not all but many of them, he said, the girls' names are always up high, about the 3rd paragraph, because I didn't want them to be forgotten. I got some criticism over that, but I persisted. Hicks knew from experience how names of victims too often could get lost in the shuffle, especially when a suspect is charged. He didn't want that for Lori, Michelle, or Denise, he said. The name that would come to dominate headlines in the case wasn't made public until June 23, 1977. That was a full 10 days after the crimes. During that time, investigators had scoured the woods for clues, followed up leads, and conducted hundreds of interviews. Most of it came to nothing. But just when it looked like all the effort was destined for frustration, Mayes County District Attorney Sid Wise called a news conference. A suspect, he said, was being charged with the murders. He was 33-year-old Gene Leroy Hart. A Locust Grove native and Cherokee Indian, Hart was already familiar to authorities. A convicted rapist and burglar, he was a 2-time prison escapee and had been on the run for 4 years since his second escape from the Mayes County Jail. Now, in addition to his previous convictions, the sentences for which totaled 300-plus years, he was facing 3 first-degree murder charges, Wise announced. As for evidence, the DA declined to say much, only that items found in a cave close to Camp Scott had been connected to Hart, who was believed to be hiding nearby. Advantageous to Hart in this, Wise added, was that he was an expert woodsman and had many family members, including his mother, living in the area. So it began. With the conclusion of that news conference, the manhunt that would go down as the largest in state history was officially underway. The hunt for Hart, fanning out for miles through tick and snake-infested hill country, would involve no less than an army of searchers, both law enforcement personnel and civilian volunteers, and also include dogs and aircraft. One of the most visible among the searchers was Mayes County Sheriff Pete Weaver, whose weathered face under his white cowboy hat became a familiar sight on nightly newscasts. Looking as if he'd stepped right out of an old Tom Mix Western, Weaver, a tall, rangy, tough-jawed lawman who delivered folksy quips in a slow drawl, led groups of volunteers through the rugged terrain. As much ground as the searchers covered, however, and with all the resources dedicated to it, the manhunt was not able to get a fix on its quarry. The days turned into weeks. If Hart indeed had been in the area, now he was nowhere to be found. Just who was Gene Leroy Hart? Outside of his criminal history and the physical description appearing almost daily in media reports, 5'10", weighs about 200, black hair, brown eyes, not much was known. Not much outside of Locust Grove, anyway. But the picture of Hart that emerged as news reporters descended on the town of approximately 1,500 residents seemed strangely at odds with what he was accused of. As then Superintendent Leonard Yarborough put it, and many others echoed, Hart, a former football star at Locust Grove High School, just wasn't the kind of kid you would have thought who would have turned out bad. One-time coach Roger Morris went even further, calling Hart, who had contributed at fullback and other positions for the Pirates, the best boy I ever coached. Off the field, former classmates seemed to agree. Hart was a quiet, polite, good-looking boy. But whatever image he had projected in high school, Hart's life from there had taken a dark turn. The real trouble came in 1966. Hart, 22 at the time and working for a Tulsa steel company, was arrested and accused of abducting 2 pregnant women from a Tulsa club and raping one of them. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 3 concurrent 10-year prison terms. Paroled after 28 months, Hart would be arrested again in Tulsa in 1969. This time, charged with 4 counts of first-degree burglary, he pleaded not guilty. He was found guilty and sentenced to a maximum of 305 years in prison. That checkered past notwithstanding, from the time Hart was announced as the main suspect in the Girl Scout slayings, he had his sympathizers, and they would only grow in number over time. Many in Mayes County doubted Hart's guilt. He was more victim than anything, others added, the authorities' go-to scapegoat when anything went wrong, a handy suspect. Hart's mother, Ella Mae Buckskin, told reporters that a vision from God had confirmed for her that my boy didn't do it. She added that Sheriff Weaver wants to frame him because he don't like Indians. The idea that Hart was being targeted because he was an Indian struck a chord with some. Indian activists spoke up for him. Other sympathizers, while agreeing that Weaver had a personal grudge against Hart, believed it was because he'd shown the sheriff up, escaping his jail twice. Those escapes, former journalist Mike Wheat believes, had helped create an aura of mystery about Hart. He had become this folklorish kind of character, a local legend, said Wheat, who covered the case for the Prior Jeffersonian, and like some kind of phantom, he seemed to materialize at random. Locals were regularly saying they saw Hart here or there, at the county fair or somewhere, Wheat said. And adding to that aura now was something else. Rumors that Hart had sought and was under the protection of tribal medicine men. This explained not only his elusiveness, many believed, but other strange happenings in and around the manhunt, like the deaths of 2 prize search dogs. As the summer of 1977 advanced, Hart hysteria had the region in its grip. The fugitive's name and face popped up everywhere in the media. Only 10 feet away, farmer thinks he saw Hart, proclaimed one Tulsa Tribune headline breathlessly. At banks throughout northeastern Oklahoma, reward funds were set up in hopes someone would provide information that might lead to Hart's capture. Thousands of dollars rolled in. From as far away as Florida, people were raising money to contribute. At the top of its front page, August 3, 1977, the Tulsa World addressed an open letter to Hart. It urged him to surrender. Offering to provide reporter Doug Hicks as a facilitator, the letter included Governor David Boren's personal guarantee to use the power of his office to ensure Hart's security and a fair trial. The letter was prompted by Hicks, who had met at a secret location with Indian activists claiming to be in touch with Hart. "I really thought that Hart was probably nearby, within a drive," Hicks said. "We thought the letter was worth a shot, but it came to nothing." Later that month, Boren himself would meet with the investigators to keep abreast of progress and to ensure cooperation from the state. "I never had any doubts we'd catch him. We just had to win once. He had to win every day," recalled Dick Wilkerson, at the time the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation's chief inspector over investigations. "There were too many good people out there working," he added, "for it to end any other way." As the weeks continued to pass, though, that optimism seemed less and less justified. The reported sightings and leads slowed to a trickle. Eventually, the search for Hart was scaled back. Media interest waned. But just when it seemed like Hart's name had disappeared for good from the headlines, suddenly it was back in big, bold type. On April 6, 1978, 10 months after the murders, the manhunt that had for so long captivated Oklahoma residents ended at a small tar paper and wood shack in the Cookson Hills of eastern Cherokee County. Briefed by phone that Hart was there, it was Wilkerson who gave the order. "My exact words were, 'Go ahead and take him. Don't kill him unless you have to, but he can't get away.'" Acting on a tip, OSBI agents converged on the site, which was home to a man named Sam Pigeon. There they found and arrested Gene Leroy Hart. In the end, it was anticlimactic. Later, Pigeon and William Lee Smith, members of a society of traditional Cherokee medicine men, would be charged with aiding Hart. On hand that night when Hart was brought to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, Hicks remembers his first glimpse of the long-sought-after mystery man. Cuffed and in chains, and with an OSBI agent to either side, Hart kept his gaze fixed on the ground and said nothing. "Besides making certain I got the photo, I was struck by his appearance," Hicks said. Hart, wearing a tank top and cut-off jeans, was out of shape, flabby. The former high school athlete appeared to have missed few, if any, meals during the long search, he said, recalling the two agents' tight holds on Hart's fleshy upper arms. Beyond that, Hicks didn't get much of a look. Almost as quickly as they'd emerged from their car, Hart and his escorts were gone from sight, swallowed up by the prison's old stone walls. It was a moment for which a lot of people had been waiting, especially the Milner, Doucet, and Farmer families. Finally in custody was the man who, according to authorities, was responsible for their daughter's murders. Now they could at least hope some answers were at hand. As relieved as she was at the news of the capture, Betty Milner had no illusions. Her daughter Denise wasn't coming back, and nothing, she knew, was going to change that. Still waking every morning to visions of her daughter's face, Milner kept playing certain scenes over in her mind, like of Denise in the kitchen making breakfast for the family. It was her own idea, in one of many ways she was stepping up to help her mom, who, by the summer of '77, was divorced from her father, Walter, Milner said. She had started getting up early every morning to do that. Then, a workday came when Denise wasn't there to make breakfast. "I felt this sadness," Milner said, of waking on Monday, June 13th, and remembering Denise was at camp. "I wanted her home." That feeling hadn't gone away when later in the morning, at school where Milner, a teacher's aide, was working summer classes, someone came to bring her to the principal's office. Her mind is hazy on the details, like who was present and who gave her the news, but not on the words. "They told me Denise is dead, she and 2 other girls. I asked if it was an accident. In my mind, I could accept an accident. Then they told me that she'd been beaten to death." Milner felt as if she, too, had just absorbed a blow. "I felt this fear. It was extreme, a fear I couldn't account for. I couldn't explain it." Thoughts of her other daughter, Kathy, flashed in her mind. What was going to happen to her, she said. How could I protect her if I couldn't protect Denise?
What you just heard was the second of 6 articles written in 2017 by Tim Stanley for the Tulsa World, as read by the author. After a short pause, we're going to go to a conversation between myself and Tim about the article that you just heard, which, along with the rest of the series, can be found on tulsaworld.com, presented with incredible new photos alongside images from the newspaper's archives. Links to those and any other relevant content can be found in the show notes. So that was episode 2, the second part of the article. I'm here with Tim Stanley, whose voice you heard reading it and who wrote it. And one of the first questions I have, the article is structured in an interesting way where you start present tense with Betty Milner, and then you go backwards in time through the manhunt and the murder, and then actually introduce Gene Leroy Hart, and then go back into his childhood, and then move back up through.
This basic framework of starting in the present and focusing on one of the families, one of the girls and their families, that was by design, which I guess probably obvious, but I thought, going into this, something that I really wanted to do throughout the series. I mean, because, there are a lot of details to this case. There are a lot of characters, and we had to scale that back even to just really the main players, just, so it'd be workable for us as a news series. But yeah, so many people, so many things happen. It's very easy to lose sight of the people I think who are at the heart of this. Obviously, the families who lost their daughters, in these terrible crimes. So, yeah, we introduced folks to Betty Milner briefly in the first story, and then to, of course, her daughter Denise, who subsequently, becomes one of the victims. And so I wanted to come back, with Betty and Denise to start this one off. Again, my intention, I think, is really to keep us coming back to them. So while we're going to go forward and we're going to talk about the case, in more detail and how that sort of unfolds through the first weeks of the investigation and the subsequent manhunt, I just want to, I want to, in doing that, always bring us back to, the people at the heart of it, and not ever let them get lost in the shuffle, so to speak, of facts. You'll notice that we do that. That's how we conclude this story too. After we bring everybody, to the conclusion of the manhunt, and when Gene Hart is finally in custody, what do we do there? I just thought it was important to end. Okay, why are we doing this? Who are we really? What is this really about? Okay, let's bring it back there. Let's remind people of the families who, were really in the middle of this and having to live this. We condense all this real history and put it into an easier to digest format. The people involved had to live this out one day at a time, 1 hour at a time, really.
You kind of mentioned Doug Hicks, one of the journalists, and that this was kind of a variation on a technique that he was using to convey the story and keep it grounded, was to make sure that the victims' names were always, in the first or second graph somewhere.
Absolutely. Doug did do that. And going back through his stories, always the names, he told me, that he made a point, as often as possible. And there's no telling how many stories that Doug ultimately wrote on this case, because, he was there from the beginning and this thing dragged on. Through the manhunt, the court proceedings, preliminary hearing and a trial. Well, Doug was part of all of that and generated an unbelievable amount of copy. But in all of that, he said that he always tried to get the girls' names in there and to get them up high. It says a lot about Doug. I didn't know him well before this. In fact, I didn't know him at all. But We also introduce our readers in this story to another reporter, Mike Wheat. He is one of 2 or 3 interviews that I think are completely critical to this whole series working like it did. In fact, Doug and Mike they're going to, you know, they were both there from the beginning for their respective papers. Doug for the Tulsa World. Mike Wheat was with a small weekly paper, Pryor, Oklahoma, so kind of the hometown paper there in Mayes County, where these events unfolded. But they both bring unique perspectives. Mike, in particular, the reason I found him and ultimately tracked him down, I saw just a random reference in one of our clip files that Mike Wheat, reporter for the Pryor Jeffersonian, that was the name of the paper, was actually on the scene that morning at Camp Scott when the bodies were found. He was one of the first people there, maybe the first member of the media. I saw that somewhere, and I'm like, you know what? I got to find this guy. I remember calling him on the phone, and I said, are you the Mike Wheat who used to write for the Pryor Jeffersonian? He said, yep, that's me. And he went from there. He told me, when I told him what I was working on, yeah, he didn't hesitate. What he ultimately adds, I think is critical to the series. Yeah, a big hat tip to both those guys. They are veteran journalists, both of them, out of the business now. They're retired, but they, having been there from day one, they followed it as closely as anyone.
One of the things that stuck with me was you have a quote from Doug where he's talking about, the difference between detachment and attachment as a journalist. And that made me think about the last conversation that you and I had, where you mentioned how you think of journalism as having a lot of empathy baked into the DNA of the job. Where does that put, the detachment versus the attachment? I'm sure those are, balls that you have to be juggling at all times when you're reporting a story like this, where you want the objective facts, but there's also, so much emotional things that, need to be covered and presented as well.
Man, I've been in this business, for over 20 years, and that's a difficult line to walk. But yeah, I double down on that as far as I think, and I think maybe it's more critical in this day and age than it ever has been. But I think, we have to be, part of what we do as journalists is to be in the business of empathy. And it's not so much me being empathetic for the subjects I write about, but even though I think that's necessary, but I think it's more about creating empathy in our readers, helping our readers to step into the shoes of other people who may be like them, who may not be like them, but to live life, to experience things as, other people have or other people do. I think that's one of the big things we're missing in the world at this moment. I think we could use a lot more empathy. Now, how do you, as a journalist, do you do that and maintain some kind of professional distance? I don't know. I think I've been able to do it, but I don't know that there's a formula. Everybody in this business who writes or for photography, whatever you do, you have to figure that out for yourself. But I would say I think it's critical. I think it's critical for people to be able to come to stories and not only just get the facts, but be able to experience life and gain some kind of understanding of the people they're reading about. I think that's one of the areas that this series succeeded in, if I can go by the feedback that I got at the time it came out and even now. I think people gained a much deeper understanding of what it was like to be in the shoes of, the farmer family, the Milners, the Goussays, what it was like to be in the shoes of a Doug Hicks or a Mike Wheat, who both of those guys had to go in at home at the end of the day after covering all this stuff and then be family men. Mike will talk about that some in a future story. That night after he covered the case for the first time, that day, the day it all broke, he went home and he just had a baby. He was bouncing his baby on his knee and just trying to figure out trying to comprehend everything that he had just seen and experienced that day.
I mean, you've definitely, forefronted the empathy from a journalistic standpoint on, the victims, the families of the victims, and you mentioned Doug Hicks and Mike Wheat, the journalists. But I mean, you also, the main character of this article that we haven't talked about too much yet is Jean Leroy Hart, who there's an empathy, I think, in the way that you frame him, at least so far as right now, where we're at in the story, and hearing about his adolescence and where he was on the football team, and people seem shocked that he could have possibly been wrapped up in this.
We do know a lot of things about him. I will also say that even today, 40 plus years later, he still is in a lot of ways an enigma. But, some of the things that we do know, he was a local guy. I mean, he grew up in the area, Ruckus Grove. Another thing that I have to understand about him, and it's going to be critical the way this story plays out, is he was a Native American, member of the Cherokee tribe. For those not in Oklahoma, you may not be aware, but there's several tribes that have their headquarters in this state. The Cherokee tribe is headquartered in Tahlequah. That's a very large tribe, has a national membership. This is Native America very much, and so you have a lot of folks with tribal ties. Hart was certainly one of those, and yeah, like I said, that's going to be a factor in some of this. He was also, by this time in his life, he was also a convicted rapist, and he had some other convictions for, I think, property crimes like burglary. He had escaped twice from custody at this point, and he'd been on the run for more than a year at the time of this crime. But he's a hard guy to being so far removed in time, and having had him die when he did, he just didn't leave a lot of information, and he's not available anymore to talk to him about any of these things. So a couple of things that come to mind here as we began to bring him into the story. Questions that people will ask is, well, this guy, he's been on the run all this time. Why had authorities not made a greater effort to bring him back in, the Mays County Sheriff's Department in particular? And that's a fair question, and they would be, roundly criticized, because frankly, after his second escape, they had not given real serious pursuit to him. I think they may differ on that. They may say, but the point being, he moved around a lot. He stayed in the woods. He had many friends, family, sympathetic people that helped him out. He would have been a difficult guy to catch, but they really didn't do much. Now, what the sheriff said at the time, and it's understandable. It's a big county, and they are the law enforcement agency for that entire county, and they just don't have the time and resources to devote to one. In other words, if they can't catch him pretty quick, it's something they just have to do when they can, and that didn't happen.
In the article, it's mentioned that he was the phrase in the article is under the protection of tribal medicine men.
Yeah, this would have been well into the manhunt itself,
which went for 10 months, I believe, until they found
Yeah,
him.
that was 10 months. And what I was talking about here was more of the period that he was at large prior to these crimes. He was pretty much known to be in and around that area. And I think we mentioned in there that he would just turn up in different places. People would say, "Oh, look, there's Gene." He had become kind of this legendary figure who would appear and disappear in that area, kind of almost tweaking law enforcement's noses, in the process. Here's this guy that everybody knows is supposed to be, in jail, but they can't ever put their hands on him. But this is where the legend of Gene Hart, if I can use that expression, kind of begins to develop. He's someone I want to say this too, because in one thing that authorities got criticized for, and maybe rightfully so, but they've been accused of zeroing in on him from day one, and of getting tunnel vision, early on in the Girl Scouts case. I will say this: if that may be true, they will say that's not true. They will say they interviewed hundreds of people, but he's someone who immediately would have been on their radar after this, and he is certainly someone that should have been at the top of their list to talk to. He was known to be at large in the area. His boyhood home, which we mentioned in the article, I think it's no longer standing, but it's not far from the camp. These woods are his stomping grounds. He knows them better than anyone. And he also has a history of sexual violence. So knowing that he is in and around that area, he absolutely would be someone you as an investigator would want to talk to first. Of course, you see the rub there. He's already a fugitive. So he, at the same time, has a powerful incentive not to talk to the police. I mean, even if he's innocent, you come forward and say, well, here's what I was doing. I wasn't there, but you come forward, you go back to prison for your earlier crimes. So in his mind, I'm sure it's better to lay low. I do think that, they were right to definitely look at him early on and try to eliminate him. That's what you do. You try to eliminate suspects. And I think they found when they started looking at him that they could not eliminate him.
There are still efforts being made with DNA evidence, new technology and scientific improvements with DNA evidence. But were there any other suspects, or was he, or were there others that he was one of many?
I think there were other people that they definitely checked out early on. They checked out surrounding property owners. There's also a Boy Scout camp just down the road from the Girl Scout camp, which was in session at that time. They checked into some of the boys, and this may be something we need to talk about in a later episode. But there are some other people, who have been suggested as strong candidates for having been involved in this. But this might not be the best place to go into that. And how much these people were on law enforcement's radar at the time of the crimes, I don't know. I know that he was at the top of their list. We can definitely say that. Given his history, he's somebody that they definitely wanted to rule in or rule out. And, if we can rule him out, we can move on to the next person. But they couldn't do that. So if that's tunnel vision, maybe they had that. But I do think that there were obviously other people that they were talking to, and he was just such an obvious candidate that he kind of stood out, for better or worse. Obviously, it would the authorities would be criticized for that, and still are. Seeming to focus too much on him at the beginning, but they will argue that they followed every lead, and there were dozens of people involved on the ground, boots on the ground, investigators in the early days, and they were getting hundreds of leads. But he definitely was a focal point from very, very early on.
And regardless, you mentioned it in the article, but the things that he had legitimately been convicted of and was a fugitive from, was it like some 300 years, the grand total he had racked up? It was, multiple lifetimes worth.
Yeah, that's another incentive for him not to get caught again, because he knows it's life.
Or worse.
Yeah. One of the questions that people always ask about this case, especially if they're outside looking in, is they're mystified why Jean Leroy Hart generated so much sympathy from certain segments of the population. And that was mystifying to me too at first, because even if he's not guilty, even if he's not involved in the Girl Scout slayings, given his recent criminal history, that would suggest that he's not a good guy. He is a convicted rapist. So I think it's puzzling to people about why so many people were so sympathetic for him. And what I've learned about that, for what it's worth, I think generally the heart sympathizers kind of fit into two categories, and they would be the people, the residents of Mays County, his home county, and specifically hometown of Locust Grove. And then the other category would be members of the Native American community. And obviously, you could have overlap with those. Again, this is Oklahoma. A lot of the folks in Mays County have Native American ties, just like they do pretty much every other county. But those two basic categories, and I think on the hometown, I think it's kind of easy if you ever lived in a small town or small community. I mean, the people you grow up with there, the people that you live with, typically you tend to think of them in a positive light. You want to see the best in them. I mean, because they're one of us, so to speak. I think I get the Locust Grove thing. Hart was from there. He had many family members, in and around that area. And again, he grew up there. He was a hometown boy. The football angle is kind of interesting. I don't want to go off into that too much, but when you go back and you look at the old articles, it's an angle that got played up a lot early on. Is local football hero wanted in Girl Scout slayings. You'll see things like that. This local football hero, local football star. Yeah, he played football. Was he a hero star? Probably not. He was definitely a contributor to the Locust Grove team. He played both ways, like a lot of guys do in high school football, particularly a small town. Played some fullback, I think, on offense. Played on defense. Now he was a good player, but that's something that the media kind of seized on. That he was like the hometown hero. That's probably a bit much, but he did. Interestingly, he was good enough. He did get one scholarship offer, I think, from a small town in Kansas. He did not take them up on that. It's one of those things where you wonder if maybe he had gone that direction. Some things might have turned out differently, but I think he did. He did not. He ended up getting married pretty quickly after high school and had a kid, and things started to go south for him real quick. But all of that to say, I kind of get the hometown thing. I do. You think you know the folks in your town better than anyone, and so I think the Native American angle is a little more complicated.
Yeah, the Native American angle is one that I feel like is, like you mentioned, to outsiders, is harder to understand, or at least just to have a contextual footing. I think especially with
Exactly.
the current state of the way that police are seen by communities of color.
I think we can definitely talk about that, and that is a factor here. I do want to say just, and this is going to be my 2 cents, which most of this is. I'm not an authority or an expert on this case. A lot of people have studied it for years. Another factor in how he was perceived, I think, in his own community and, even beyond. Let's think about what he did, because this is something that we just kind of pay lip service to in the article. We don't go into a lot of detail about his previous crimes. I mean, his rape convictions were for two women that he picked up at a bar. And if you read the old news articles about their testimony, it's not pretty. I mean, these were brutal crimes. Hart's contention was that it was consensual, but I mean, you can't read the articles and not think that these were rapes when you hear their testimony. Now, here's what I would say about that, about him being a convicted rapist. And it's, again, this is total speculation, but I think attitudes about rape have changed over the years. And I think, and when this happened, these crimes, we're talking late 60s, early 70s, I don't think in that era that rape was viewed in quite the same light as it now. I want to emphasize, I'm not saying it wasn't taken seriously, but I do think too often victims were blamed, or at least, considered maybe equal partners in the offense. The old, oh, well, she led him on. What did she expect kind of excuse. I think that existed. I think it still exists. I think we've come a long way. Obviously, the last 3 or 4 years, with the Me Too movement, a lot of things I think have changed, maybe about how people perceive some of these things. But, 50 years ago, I think it was a little different. And so I think also I think there were people who thought that Hart's rape charges were trumped up, exaggerated, and that the women probably, they were involved in it more than they would admit in what happened. Now, part of that is because Hart would claim that, but given that I think attitudes about rape are a little different then, I think that might explain, why some people who sympathize with Hart maybe didn't take the rape conviction so seriously. And then the other stuff was like property crime.
But nothing, I mean, to hear you tell it, and I don't know the details of it, but it sounds like the original rape conviction had an element of brutality to it, exceeding, I think,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
But it still doesn't seem like this was necessarily, I mean, the idea of three children being murdered is,
I mean, a lot of people would say that. Yeah. How do you go from that to this? That's something we can talk about too, and I think maybe it'd be more appropriate in a future.
and it's also it's tough to talk about, again, just because there's so much conjecture there that it's from a journalistic standpoint, it's difficult to check out and validate any of those things from any evidence.
Back on the people outside of Oklahoma and understanding the Native American community. That's something we can say a couple of things about because he definitely had a lot of sympathizers among Native Americans. Not all of them, certainly, and I'm sure many would take issue with me saying that there were a lot in support of him, but he was Cherokee in the Cherokee tribe, definitely, and we will interview, in a future story, the guy who was the tribe's principal chief at that time, and get his thoughts on this. So I won't go into that too much now. It's Ross Swimmer, because the tribe actually, tribal council did help pay for some of his defense, Hart's defense, and we'll talk more about why and what that means. But I think big picture here, you can't understand this case unless you understand the era and the historical context. This was very much the age of activism. I mean, beginning in the 1960s and continuing into the 70s, you had many, many minority groups who were organizing for the first time and demanding change, and they were defending their rights. And that was true of Native Americans. I mean, and so Hart's cause was taken up, by some among the Native American activist community. And I'm thinking specifically of one group who we do mention in the story called AIM, capital AIM, which stands for American Indian Movement. It's something that's interesting. And again, for those not living in Oklahoma, the investigators and law enforcement officials who worked this case, many of them were also Native Americans, had tribal ties. And many of them would, emphasize that later in defending how this case was handled and in defending against, the charges or the charge that they were biased against natives. They're like, wait a minute, we're Native American too. But I think what AIM and what a lot of the American Indian activists were trying to address at that time, not just in Oklahoma, but nationwide. Now, we wouldn't have used this phrase at the time, but it's one we know well now, and that is systemic racism. I think their concern was systemic racism specifically in the American justice system. So while many involved on both sides in this had tribal connections, the issue for AIM was not the individuals, but the system, which they would argue is inherently racist and had a history of producing negative outcomes, for Native Americans. So for them, Hart was just the latest example of this. And so they naturally kind of rallied around him. I think, well, we even, when we do mention this in there, I think it's in this story. One of the activists, I think Doug Hicks actually interviewed some of them. And as I recall, he went to, they took him out to a place.
You didn't name any names.
Exactly. Yeah. One of them, I think we quoted as one of the activists, when they looked at Hart, what they saw was, quote, an old Indian boy running scared, unquote. In other words, Hart represented a scenario for them that they had seen too many times before, a history repeating itself. And, another, a Native American man who's got on the wrong side of the justice system unfairly in their minds. So when you start to understand a little bit of that context, you can begin to at least understand some of the sympathy, I think, among Native Americans for Hart, and how among maybe these activists, he became almost like an anti-hero, in some larger drama. I think that context is critical to really understanding this entire case and, why Native Americans were, if they weren't sympathetic towards him, they were at least ambivalent in some respects because they had seen so many similar scenarios before and, assumed rightly or wrongly that this was just another example of a Native American man, being, pursued in an unfair and unjust system.
I mean, we're talking about a culture and a community, that has been, I mean, you mentioned systemic racism, but we're also talking about centuries of disenfranchisement.
Exactly. If any group has a reason in this country not to trust the authorities, it's Native Americans, given their history. So there's that layer to it. So you can see that it just gets to be complicated in what you're dealing with here because there's so many, different layers to this.
Or at the very least, that people who were sympathetic to Hart had a context on which that made sense.
Exactly. And again, see that if you're just looking at this from the outside, that can be very puzzling. But when you start to understand a little bit of the context, yeah, it makes more sense. It's part of this story.
Yeah. So that definitely gets us to the next article in the series, which is all about the trial, where I guess, the circus, so to speak, comes to town.
Yep. That's a good way to describe it. I mean, so much about this case was circus-like, and that includes something that we didn't get to go into a lot, and that's the preliminary hearing itself, the one that preceded the trial. It was the longest preliminary hearing in state history, and it had its own kind of circus-like atmosphere. But we can talk about that a little more next time as we get into the trial and court proceedings.
Thanks for tuning in to Late Edition Crime Beat Chronicles. We hope you've enjoyed the episode. There's a lot more where that came from just over the horizon. So make sure that you're subscribed to the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. As I said earlier, there are a ton of incredible additional resources that you can explore on tulsaworld.com, which I'll have links to in the show notes. The show was produced, recorded, and edited by me, Chris Lay, with tremendous thanks to Tim Stanley and the rest of the team at the Tulsa World for the work they put in reporting this series in 2017. For Lee Enterprises, I'm Chris Lay.